Welcome back to Satori Sounds. Today, we're diving into a conversation that touches every aspect of our personal and professional lives: confidence, skills and abilities, and identity. How do we truly build confidence? What role does self-efficacy play in our own development? And are we chasing an ideal version of ourselves that only leads to frustration? In this episode, we unpack the balance between humility and self-assurance, the power of internal motivation, and why self-mastery is the key to long-term fulfilment. If you're on a journey of growth and self-discovery, this one's especially for you. You always want to be, you want to be getting better, right? And improving yourself. But by that very nature, you then kind of have to navigate that bit of unknown. And so I think that's what we're going to talk about, is something around that, especially from like a professional world. For me, is the chartership, but then also bringing in a bit more of your clinical world, because in a way, like, the risks are comparable but very different.
And I think that's a great intro into this episode. That's a good way of introducing it. And I think when we think about competence and maybe themes of confidence, I think it's a central question of identity in many regards. Because you have to, if you want to be competent at something, whatever it is, you have to start to ask yourself the question, what am I not good at? You become the central focus.
I absolutely. And knowing that, I think that's also, I would say that's more important to know than what you do know. You know where your limits are. And I definitely discovered that through my chartership, was that I thought, I'd come into this world, I'd join the RSCS and become a chartered surveyor. And I wanted to, be the best possible one that I could be. And I thought that meant knowing everything. And I suddenly realised actually the breadth of all of that information. And one day someone turned around to me and said, it's also knowing what you don't know. Competence is knowing what you don't know as much as knowing what you do know.
Yeah. And I think that idea of what you don't know is how you begin to amalgamate that into what you do know in many regards. And coming back to that idea of identity, there's a term in social sciences called ethogenics, which is effectively, I suppose, the study of how people form their identities and attach meaning to their actions. And talking about professional competence, for example, is a really, really good example of that. Because what you're effectively doing is you're going, I want to develop these skills or this knowledge base. How do I do that? I do that through these actions. These actions go on to shape the view of myself on how well I do them. And how others recognize them as well. So it becomes this base of reasoned action. You have to begin to think about, why am I doing it? What am I doing? Who am I in this context? Who do I want to become? And that's why I started with that idea of, actually central to that is the idea of who you are, your identity.
Yeah, who you are, definitely. And also that evolves in a way as you kind of progress in that world, not just in your professional competence, but we've talked about values changing previously, and actually, recognizing that those things do change and navigating it. I think it's easy for me to stick in this professional mindset because I've focused on it so much. But another term that I've definitely used to that point of recognizing that is trying to adopt a bit more of a beginner's mindset, because I've got to the point in my career where I can walk into most things and I go, I know how I'm doing this, and there's a lot of competence in my mind that comes with it. And I've done that with meetings and other things. But as I moved more into a leadership position, I had to almost bring that beginner's mindset back, because I've gone from me knowing much to actually trying to enable other people and getting them to be more effective. And that bit of who are you, it's recognizing where you are on that journey, or also sometimes in different situations, the role, that you have to play. A lot of the time that I do now, with the decisions that I'm making, I'm actually just trying to enabling those other people. And so as much as sometimes I think I already know that right answer, a lot of the time I spend is trying to help those other people not actually stretch themselves, but have that space to be able to bring the best out in themselves.
That actually reminds me of a book I was reading by an academic called John L. Smith. His book is called The Psychology of Action. Now, this text is very much concerned with why people do what they do and what do they do, basically. And I think what you're saying there really relates to this concept that he draws. And he draws two distinctions. And these are very familiar words that we use in everyday language, but he uses them very differently. He uses them in their root form. So he uses agent and patient. And when he talks about the patient role, he doesn't talk about it in terms of illness. He talks about it in terms of experiencing. And for a large part of our life, the patient, we all play that at some point in school. We are experiencing education. And what he's talking about when he mentions the agent is saying, actually, there comes a point where we need to engage in action. As soon as we start doing something actively and not being passive, we switch into that agent role. And what you're effectively doing when you bring people up is you're turning them into agents. You're teaching them the skills to affect action or change. So they're not passively sitting back and experiencing things. Oh, this is the system. It just is what it is. You're encouraging them to take action and to do different things. Building what we call in CBT the loci of control or locus of control.
Locus of control, interesting. That makes sense. And how does that then, if you're bringing them into that space of action, that element of control, that's in terms of trying to help enable them to maybe, as you say, move to that change in a way? So is it, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, are you trying to give them that space where they think they can move into that space to make the change?
I suppose when we think about locus of control, it's helping them recognize what things in the environment they can affect. It might be, I don't know in your context of teaching, but say in ours, when we're learning CBT, one of the earliest things we teach people is how to formulate and what formulation means and how you can use that to affect change. And that's the first skill that you get. And you go, okay, I'm making sense of this and I can move toward helping someone because I can formulate their difficulty. And that's kind of that starting building block. So then you build other skills on top of that, and then they can add to that locus of control if you're like, oh, well, actually my formulation only encompasses this. It doesn't encompass anything else. And I suppose what you're effectively going to do from that is show them what is it they can affect and what is it they can't affect, and what is the limit and the potential of their competence. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, it does. And what I was hearing there is that that formulation, but you're almost giving those building blocks. You're teaching them something, and something else can get added on from there. So it's almost like a toolkit in a way. You've got to start somewhere, and then you can build from there. I think that's really relatable to my industry as well. But I think a lot of people is, you've got to take that little baby step of something, and the word foundation is kind of jokingly used in our industry because construction foundations, they're used a lot, but you've got to build that foundational knowledge of something, and then you can incrementally improve from there. I think, and that's, we've talked about not knowing, but I also think about if you're at that position where you go, I don't know, and I want to try and move forward, actually understanding those first principles, those foundations. That's a really good point, and that formulating that you were explaining there, I think a lot of people resonate with, because you've got to sometimes break it down. I've often done that with big issues, is actually, well, okay, something looks completely insurmountable. Let's break it down. We've talked about it in the habits as well. You've just got to start somewhere with it. But the other bit I was thinking as you were saying that is that when you're trying to get people into that space, I think also our behaviours, and I look at this with change of how I navigate change with kind of companies or delivering it with projects, where quite often people are very resistant to change. And actually there gets to a point where they then start to acknowledge that a change needs to happen from there. And that's where it can cause a lot of friction. And then you kind of come up the other side eventually where it starts to normalise itself out. And I think that's correlative to competence in a way, because sometimes you can think, right, I'm doing really well at something, and then you kind of almost come crashing down because you go, actually, I don't know as much as I did. And then you kind of come up the other side from that, and eventually you kind of balance out again. And actually, I think there's that constant correlative of testing, coming down a bit and going back up.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because it's thinking about this idea called self-efficacy, and I don't know if I've ever spoken about it before. So stop me if you've heard this kind of notion before. But Bandura came up with this idea of self-efficacy effectively, and it's his theory of self-efficacy. I believe so I can. And actually, I think competence relates to that. And what you're beginning to describe is when people go, oh, I don't know if I can do that. They might kind of get it wrong. and go, okay, I couldn't do that. So what do I need to go away and do that? And you've got the other end of that spectrum where people might get it wrong, make a mistake or whatever it is, and begin to languish and go, okay, I've given up. And I suppose it's noting that people that have that higher self-efficacy, I believe I can, they'll get it wrong and they're more likely to bounce back and be like, I can do this. And as a result, kind of go on to become more competent. But it's noticing those who might kind of lack that sense of self-efficacy, that low sense of, it's not self-esteem, and that's the distinction. They're two different things, self-efficacy and self-esteem. So self-esteem is the opinion of the self, and self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to overcome something or do something. And you might see that in bounce back you're describing. It might not happen in those that have a sense of low efficacy.
So they might get stuck in that point of I've tried and I didn't do it, and therefore I'm not going to improve. They almost get to that first point where they think they've tried and they've proved that they couldn't do it, and so they're stuck in that. I'm sure someone's used a term like that before. It's the valley of despair or something. That's probably a very emotive way of saying it, but I think I've heard that before, is that you're just in that, almost that rut. That's really interesting. That's really interesting about the efficacy bit. I hadn't heard it framed like that.
That's why I brought up that sense of identity right at the beginning, because typically if you see yourself as less, if you see yourself as not very good or undeserving of achieving what you want to achieve, that's correlated with a sense of low self-efficacy. And as a result, you're never going to disprove it because you're frightened to almost try, or you're demotivated to try. And so it was really, really good to hear that sense of the valley of despair, because you do get stuck there into a very vicious cycle. So you might, and again, coming back to that sense of identity, you might try and do something to prove that you are good at something, you are quote unquote competent, get it a little bit wrong, and that feeds into that core belief of, well, I'm no good. And as a result, your self-esteem plummets as well as your self-efficacy, and it just goes round and round and round. So you might stay in that valley a bit longer.
So is that almost self-reinforcement, isn't it? That you're hearing that and you're almost validating it. So I guess what we're saying to people there is be aware of where you might be on that journey, right? If you've tried and you haven't got from where you want to be, maybe you need to try it slightly differently, but don't use that as a validation if you can't do something. And I think where I've definitely learnt to improve with that is actually, getting other people's perspectives and also learning. Sometimes seeking out people who have done something, or I've particularly as I've been moving forward with things. In a work example of, I was taking on leading the commissioning of a building, which we have a commissioning services engineer, but due to the complexity of this and the way it needs to be programmed between preparation to opening, it needed a lot more hands-on management. I'd never managed commissioning in my life before, and so I kind of originally went into there with absolutely no competence at all, but that little bit of confidence going, okay, I don't know how to do this, but actually I know the right people are getting in there and hearing other people's views where I was saying, well, I think we should be doing this. And so I think often when we're navigating that next step, seeking out maybe people who have done it before, or getting the other views of others, can help give yourself a little bit of humility in a way and not being that complete overconfidence.
It's a theory of mind skill, isn't it? I don't know, who might know, how do I know they know? And you're beginning to work out, what do others know? And you're looking at your blind spots and using their knowledge base to build on you. And Pamela Trevick, who's I think a social work author, she calls this capacity building. So you're expanding your ability to do things.
Interesting. So you're expanding your capacity to do things. So, well, again, it goes back to what we talk about, the foundations and those little building blocks, right, for people, actually, isn't it? So, you're getting comfortable, but you've put frameworks in place to go, okay, I've just got to do this, and then I can build from that, and then I can build from that. Because I think, especially being logically driven, I always try and seek out what's that next step. And I've definitely realised that a lot of things can't be broken down into that. There's not always that clarity that kind of comes through. And so actually that regular reviewing that we were just talking about can really help with that as you try and navigate each of that. And I think the ability to adapt and learn from it as well. It's not just retrying the same thing over and over and over and over again necessarily. If something's not working, try something slightly different and adjust. And I think that's another way that you can stretch yourself as well, isn't it? You've got to do it in the safety nets of whatever kind of theatre you're operating within as such. But I think stretching yourself slightly is another way to build that competence. It goes back to that compounding, doesn't it? Small incremental margins of improvement over time you'll just see a huge competence increase.
Yeah, and I think another thing to be wary of when you're building your own competence, and I'm aware we're using competence and incompetence a lot, and they're very emotionally charged words, and we'll come on to that in momentarily. But one of the things I think is important to stress is be aware of something called the ideal self. And that might be where you're effectively building up a framework of you with all these skills, what it looks like. It's almost perfectionism. It's the idealized version of yourself with skills and knowledge. It's almost perfect. And it's asking yourself the question, how likely is that to align with the real self? And am I beginning to effectively say, I need to be this perfect thing that doesn't really exist? And as a result, am I beating myself up because of it? And it's a Maslowian concept. So Maslow was very famous for doing his hierarchy of needs. And basically, once all our basic needs are met, we come into that realm of considering what we are, who we are now. And he calls it self-actualization. What is it that we need to generally be happy? And it's watching out for that, because leaning too heavily into an ideal self, that perfect notion, well, that can lead to a lot of discontent because it's never necessarily achievable.
Huge amount of discontent, and it can change as well, can't it? We've talked about it previously, where you climb that mountain, you get to it, and you realise actually you want to be on a different mountain. But that perfection bit that you picked up, I think, is a real key point, because you can build this whole image up, and I'm going through it right now. I built this whole thing around wanting to get to this career point, and I've got there, and I built this image, and I'm kind of now reevaluating it completely. I think you're right. I think it can definitely help having that vision. And that's an interesting concept, actually. At what point does having that vision and driving through almost, it's good to have those goals and visions, but at what point can it become almost unhealthy?
And at what point are you just chasing for the sake of chasing? Chasing to avoid core beliefs that you've built up about yourself? Who knows? And it's that question, and that's a painful question to ask. That's why I started out this episode, when I said it's about identity. What is it that you need from this competency to make you feel a bit more complete or make you feel satisfied? Why are you doing it? Is it to say, just prove other people wrong? Or is it generally because you want to get better? What is it about that specific skill or professional body of ability that you want to amalgamate into yourself? Why? And you have to start with that.
It's very true, because if you're going to change, understanding that why and the motive behind it, right? Because that's a key driver for change, is understanding why you want to do it. So I hadn't framed it that way before. That's quite an interesting way of looking at it in that sense. I was going to go back to humility, right? Because you're saying about what are you doing it for, right? And actually, if you're just doing it for yourself in the sense of trying to prove that you're better than someone else, then that's, well, it might be a value you want to carry, but for me, the humility is more important, and actually that bit of understanding where you get to that zone of your competence, right? You don't really want to act or think like you're better than anyone else. And so I think that's just really resonated with what you were saying there about the why you're doing it and being aware of it, because I think we can all subconsciously want to get better and improve, but that shouldn't ever come from a place of wanting to do that to act like you're better than someone else.
And just to add to that, so stepping away from the humility, but kind of it's conjunctive, so they're next to each other. The idea of wanting to be competent to be better than someone else, you'll forever be kept at that level. Your ability and your potential will always be external. Whereas if you're doing it to be better than you, who you were previously, then your potential skyrockets, becomes uncapped, because you're forever growing. And I learned that from a bloke in the gym he was like 70, and he turned out to be when I say a judo pro, he was a real judo pro, and he started teaching me. And one day he told me a story about the British Olympic team in, I think it was like the 2000s or stroke 90s. And he was saying they had a dip. So they were outperforming most teams and getting Olympic gold. They were almost like superstars. But where they began to fall down was they were doing it from the perspective, I want to be better than that team. I want to be better than that team. I want to be better than that individual judo player, so on and so forth. And they hired a Japanese coach to come in because they were losing. And he was in this press conference. They go, what do you think of the British team? The Japanese coach turned around and said he thought the British team were crap. And apparently this shocked the press conference because they hadn't heard such fragrant honesty. And then, why do you think they're crap? And he turned around and said, the problem is they don't want to be better than themselves. They always want to be better than someone else. And because of that, they're not growing. And it comes back to that statement of capacity building, and your motivations for wanting to increase your capacity to deal with demands. Why are you doing it?
That's a really poignant story. I think that will resonate with a lot of people, right? And I think definitely the key message is that it's got to come from within. You're doing it for yourself, and actually all you've got to do is keep coming back and being better than you were yesterday on yourself, your own self-improvement. And it goes back to what you were saying around the self-actualization as well, is that, that's something that you strive towards, but you don't necessarily ever achieve. There's always ways that we can improve, and always that. So actually focusing on self-mastery instead of focusing on other people, you'll get a lot further. I really like that.
I've never found the interview, so shout out to Sensei Ken. If you can plug us with that interview, that'd be great. But yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition, and yet I suppose one of the reasons it's so interesting to me is because there's this idea in psychology by two chaps called Fishbein and Asgen, and they came up with it in the 70s, and it's called the theory of reasoned action. And effectively, what this theory posits is that our behavioural intentions are comprised of our own attitudes. So it's our attitudes plus social norms. So the behavioural intention equals attitudes and social norms we're surrounded with. And I suppose what they're really drawing quite nicely there is it's how you view the thing itself, whatever it is you're doing, like competency, if you're learning a skill, and also how the people around you view that, so you take on board their attitudes as well.
So that is that in aspects of getting that feedback and taking on, or are you saying they take it on subconsciously?
It's both a subconscious and an active process, and you might be familiar with the term iron sharpens iron. So if you're I don't know, trying to be, who knows, judo champion of the world, and you're hanging around with people who don't really value that goes on board in your conscious and subconscious. And it will begin to impact upon your behavioural intention, what you intend to happen, whether it's learning a skill or kind of any other form of behaviour, really.
That makes sense. It's that term, you're the sum of the five people you spend the most time with. It's that element, isn't it, right? So I think that's another key thing, actually, around that competence, though. That is, spending time or being aware of the people that you're spending time with on that. It's easy. Like we've talked about it before with having an accountability partner and things. But if it is judo, actually training with other people who have that similar goal, you'll keep, as long as you're focusing on your self improvement, you can go with them and you can both just keep lifting each other up. So that's definitely another good tool for people that they can use in a way, isn't it? As a takeaway, is find someone else that's on a similar journey. Don't look to copy them, but learn how you can just better each other and go from there.
And it's like Naval Ravikant says, you're only competing if you're copying. So when you start to notice yourself competing with someone else in a field that you're doing, it's because you're trying to copy them. Don't do that. You need to be you in that situation to become truly competent in anything. And I know this from training as a therapist. You see it all the time. We get shown instructional videos of, this is how you ask a Socratic question. And we've all seen the Beck video. And if you haven't seen it, go away and Google it and you'll see what I mean. We try and copy that Beck style and it doesn't work because it's not us. And it crashes. And sure, some people are better at copying than others, but it flops. And that's because you have to develop your own style when it comes to learning new skills and abilities. And I'm using skills and abilities. I'm leaning away from competence and incompetence now because they are very emotionally loaded terms. It feels good when someone says we're competent at something, or maybe just for me. And it can hurt when someone goes, you're incompetent. And we've seen in all the crazy American movies, or maybe those reels where someone has a go at a fast food worker and they're like, one of the first things they say is you're incompetent. and it hurts. So don't necessarily fall into that dichotomy of I'm good or I'm bad. It's thinking about what skills can I grow and what abilities can I grow and what haven't grown quite yet.
Definitely. It's not that black and white, is it? As you say, that competence and incompetence. We've all got our own skills and our abilities. We're all on our own different path, and those naturally we've got more skill and ability in some areas and less in others, right? And actually understanding what you don't know and how to improve that, that own awareness, right? It's what's the term that sits around that of not knowing? Oh, don't be ignorant of your own ignorance, right? You've just got to understand where you are with that. Don't be ignorant of your own ignorance. Work on your own abilities, work on your own skills, keep turning up for yourself, keep improving, being the best that you personally can be.
And it comes back to that again, doesn't it? You. It has to be related to your identity. It can't be anyone else. You have to be an agent. You have to be active in combating that ignorance that you've highlighted there.